How is it that the skyscrapers we see today seem to have evolved backwards, at least aesthetically? The seemingly boring skyscraper of the mid-1900s that has come to dominate our skylines is a relatively recent development. And believe it or not, the world's tallest buildings weren't always devoid of a grandiose artistic nature. Skyscrapers used to be Art Deco and Neo-Gothic. So what happened? Though early examples exist elsewhere, the skyscraper was truly born in America, and nobody shaped its development more than Sullivan. Before getting to how we got from this to this, let's look at some of the earliest examples in history of the idea of a skyscraper. National Geographic ran an article titled "Ancient Mud Skyscraper City is the Manhattan of the Desert," writing that at the edge of a desolate expanse of desert in Yemen, known as the Empty Quarter, the 16th century walled city of Shibam remains the oldest metropolis in the world to use vertical construction. Perhaps even earlier ideas of the skyscraper exist, however. Between the 12th and the 13th century, numerous towers were built in the city of Bologna, Italy. Some sources report 180 towers. It is not yet clear why so many towers were built, but it is believed that the richest families were in the era of the investment disputes used as a means of attack and defense. Almost 20 of the numerous towers that adorn the city of Bologna in ancient times have been preserved today. The two most prominent ones remaining, known as the Two Towers, are a landmark of the city. So getting back now to Sullivan, who is an American architect and has been called the father of skyscrapers. His greatest achievement was to synthesize older architectural ideas with an entirely new type of building. Sullivan designed a building that was tall, imposing, and elegant. The 8-story Carson Peary Scott building in Chicago in 1899 was the first in the United States to feature the classic forms and massing of the skyscraper. It was also the first in the world to feature a steel frame that supported the entire building. Sullivan skyscrapers blended traditional designs with the latest innovations. They often featured ornately decorated exteriors with Art Deco and Neo-Gothic details. However, as the need for taller and larger skyscrapers increased, Sullivan's designs were gradually replaced by simpler, less ornate buildings. The more conventional approach to design, with simpler facades and more open interiors, eventually became the norm. Modern construction methods and technologies made Sullivan skyscrapers possible, but it wasn't obvious how they should look. Sullivan lamented the overeducated architects who produced things like the New York Times building. His Wainwright building is a much more elegant formulation. In an 1896 essay called "The Tall Office Building Artistically Considered," Sullivan outlines his design principles. Though the famous "form follows function" maxim is attributed to him, and he was the first to put it like that, it's an old architectural idea, nor does it mean what we usually think. Sullivan's point wasn't that the architecture should be functionalist, excluding aesthetic considerations, but that aesthetic principles must be suited to the form of the building at hand, which for skyscrapers Sullivan saw as loftiness. In any case, Sullivan's style dominated for decades and was the foundation for the many great Neo-Gothic and Neoclassical skyscrapers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries in America, even for the more futuristic Art Deco of the 1930s. Prior to the late 19th century, the weight of a multi-story building had to be supported principally by the strength of its walls. The taller the building, the more strain this placed on the lower sections of the building, since there were clear engineering limits to the weight such load-bearing walls could sustain. Tall designs meant massively thick walls on the ground floors and definite limits on the building's height. The development of cheap, versatile steel in the second half of the 19th century changed those rules. America was in the midst of rapid social and economic growth that made for great opportunities in architectural design. A much more urbanized society was forming, and the society called out for new, larger buildings. The mass production of steel was the main driving force behind the ability to build skyscrapers during the mid-1880s. By assembling a framework of steel girders, architects and builders could create tall, slender buildings with a strong and relatively lightweight steel skeleton. The rest of the building's elements, walls, floors, ceilings, and windows, were suspended from the skeleton, which carried the weight. This new way of constructing buildings, so-called column frame construction, pushed them up rather than out. The steel weight-bearing frame allowed not just for taller buildings, but permitted much larger windows, which meant more daylight-reaching interior spaces, and interior walls becoming thinner, which created more usable and rentable floor space. Chicago's Monadnock building, not designed by Sullivan, straddles this remarkable moment of transition. The northern half of the building, finished in 1891, is of load-bearing construction, while the southern half, finished only 2 years later, is of column frame construction. While experiments in this new technology were taking place in many cities, Chicago was the crucial laboratory. So after Sullivan's revolution took place, what changed thereafter? Well, in 1893, a disgruntled Austrian architect called Adolf Loos
Loos
came to the World's Fair in Chicago, where he saw Sullivan's Skyscrapers. Remember that Europe in Loos's time was dominated by revivalist styles, whether Neo-Gothic, Neoclassical, or Neo-Byzantine. Loos was an inspiration to modernism and a widely known critic of the Art Nouveau movement. The Art Nouveau movement is basically applied decorative arts, which Loos was against. He essentially pushed functionalism, which is the principle that buildings should be designed based solely on their purpose and function. Functionalism was an international architectural movement which emerged in the wake of World War I as part of the wave of modernism. Loos had seen the future, but what struck him most about America were its grain silos and water towers, which he saw while living in the countryside. He considered them perfectly rational architecture, focused on utility and nothing else, devoid of useless ornamentation. Loos returned to Europe and started designing things like the Steiner House in Vienna. It may look modern, but it was built in 1910. He believed ornamentation was a waste of money, time, and labor. It was irrational and ill-suited to the modern industrial machine age. In his influential essay, Ornamentation and Crime, Loos said, "I have reached the following conclusion which I give to the world. The evolution of culture is equivalent to the removal of ornamentation from utilitarian objects." He took Sullivan's maxim to the extreme. Part of Germany and Central Europe had already seen attempts to reconcile modern materials, methods, and social needs with architecture, as in the Baron's 1909 AEG factory, which appears like a form of industrial classicism, complete with stylized columns and pediments. But Loos's more radical style triumphed. His belief in functionalist architecture, devoid of ornament and color, totally utilitarian and rational in nature, wielded a huge influence over an entire generation of European architects. The Bauhaus school, founded in 1919, was the most famous institution to embrace this aesthetic. For example, Le Corbusier shared Loos's extreme views and based his fame treaty towards an architecture on Loos's ideas from ornamentation and crime. The architecture of Le Corbusier seems like a more stylish version of what Loos was doing. Encouraged by the German government, the Bauhaus school sought to unify all crafts and arts together and reconcile them with mass production to create both quality and quantity for the public. In 1927, the Deutscher Werkbund invited Bauhaus architects, along with Le Corbusier, to design a housing estate. It was intended as an example of how to build cheap and efficient housing, and it prophesied the future. Underlying all of this was a futuristic urge, for Europe had been devastated by World War I, and its traditional architecture symbolized that. They wanted to build a better world, hence their interest in urban planning, and consider Le Corbusier's model for a reconstruction of Paris. The then disease-plagued Le Marais would be replaced by a gridded phalanx of 18 cruciform office towers over several square miles. The towers would sit in a multi-tiered park. One level was an immense amount of green space, another was for transportation. Le Corbusier was a Swiss-French architect and one of the pioneers of what is now regarded as modern architecture. He asked viewers to imagine themselves in this reworked Paris city, declaring that the street as we know it will cease to exist, and the Paris of tomorrow could be magnificently equal to the march of events that is day by day bringing us even nearer to the dawn of a new social contract. Everything changed, however, in 1933, when under pressure from the Nazi regime and its attacks on anything avant-garde or modernist, the Bauhaus school was closed. Its architects left Germany and took their ideas around the world, especially to America, where they were taught at Harvard. In the 1930s, of course, the Art Deco was still in vogue in America, but the modernists didn't like it. Consider what Le Corbusier wrote about Art Deco, echoing Loos's beliefs that ornamentation was irrational, and he was right. Art Deco turned out to be a short-lived movement. These modernist ideas, whether of Le Corbusier, Bauhaus, or the Scandinavian functionalist, had collectively become known as the international style. And in the post-war decades, it became the style of the New World, one of global population booms and economic progress. One of the leading members of the Bauhaus and the final director of the school was Ludwig de Rohe. He, like Sullivan, wanted to create a style suited to the modern age no less than the classical had been to the ancient and the Gothic to the medieval. Ludwig settled in Chicago, and in 1958 he designed the Seagram building, the ultimate statement of this international style and a far cry from those old Neo-Gothic and Art Deco towers. His glass-clad skyscrapers would become the ultimate modernist form. Ludwig, more than any other, understood the potential of glass. It could be mass-produced on an industrial level and used as a curtain wall to clad large buildings cheaply. And inspired by Loos, he believed that such structural materials had an innate aesthetic quality. A wave of such skyscrapers appeared all around the world. This was a universal approach indifferent to local architectural tradition or even climate. A functional and rational style suited to the modern age and devoid of any ornamentation or color. Modernism ultimately won out. Variations and offshoots appeared, especially in the form of brutalism. Of course, however, even the international style has now been replaced by a wave of more expressive, playful, and dynamic skyscrapers, and gone are the sleek slabs of glass. The ideas of Loos, Le Corbusier, the Bauhaus, and others, their principles remain triumphant.